Hello, my name is Dustin Gilbreath, and I'm the Deputy Research Director at CRRC-Georgia. Today, I'm going to be presenting the results of a new survey which we conducted between March 7th and 10th of last week. The survey focuses on Georgian public opinion on the war in Ukraine. In presenting the findings, I'll briefly cover the methodology of the study. Afterwards, I'll get into the findings as relates responsibility for the war in Ukraine, Georgia's response to the war in Ukraine, steps the public wants the government to take in response to the war, and finally conclude with a few notes on domestic politics. I'll end with a brief summary of the findings. So the survey was conducted between March 7th and 10th of last week, basically, and it was conducted using computer-assisted telephone interviewing with random digit dialing for the sampling. In this regard, the study is nationally representative as well as independently representative of Tbilisi, other urban areas, and rural areas. The sample size we had was 1,092. We ended up with a margin of error of 2.96% and a response rate of 24%. The study covered the key issues which I mentioned previously on the last slide. And before getting into the findings, I wanted to note that some of the figures did not sum to 100% due to a combination of rounding error and question type. So for example, some questions respondents were allowed to answer with multiple response options. So without further ado, who do Georgians think is responsible for the war? 80% of the public places the blame on either the Russian Federation or Vladimir Putin personally. Few people in Georgia think that the United States, Vladimir Zelensky, NATO, or some other Western or Ukrainian institution is responsible for this war. At the same time, 9% of the public was uncertain on this issue. When it comes to Russia's reasons for invading Ukraine, the public generally thinks that it was to conquer territory or to conquer Ukraine. Overall, 59% of respondents said something like this, one of these two response options. Aside from this, a fifth of the public believes that Putin wanted to revive the Soviet Union and to prevent NATO from joining, or prevent Ukraine from joining NATO rather. About 1 in 6 in the public believe that. Other response options were named by relatively few, with the exception of uncertainty. So 15% of the public, roughly 1 in 6 people, is uncertain on how to respond to this question. When it comes to the Georgian government's response to the war in relation to Ukraine, the public tends to think, so 61% think that the government of Georgia needs to support the government of Ukraine more. A further third of the public thinks that the government is supporting the government of Ukraine at an adequate level. Only 3% think that the government of Georgia should provide less support to Ukraine or should not support Ukraine at all. With regards to which steps the government of Georgia might be able to take in regards to supporting Ukraine, the public was overwhelmingly supportive of almost all of the options that we asked about on the survey. So 97% of the public thinks that supplying Ukraine with humanitarian assistance, such as food and medicine, would be something that they would support. Temporarily accepting Ukrainian refugees, 96% of the public thinks that this is a step that the government could take. Pardon. Further, 91% of the public thinks that Georgian government, they would support and find it fully acceptable to provide financial assistance to Ukraine. Fewer people, but still 2/3 of the public think that the government of Georgia should allow volunteers from Georgia to go to Ukraine to fight. Even 53% of the public think that the Georgian government should supply Ukraine with weapons and military equipment. Aside from asking about these steps which the government of Georgia could take to support Ukraine, the survey also asked about introducing restrictions on the entrance of citizens of the Russian Federation to Georgia. In this regard, 59% of the public would support the introduction of such restrictions. With regard to sanctions, which have been a key issue in the toolbox in fighting the war against Russia from the West, the public tends to think that the current restrictions, or the current sanctions rather, should be made more severe, with 71% of the public supporting this idea. 10% think that they should remain in their current form, and only 7% think that either the sanctions should be lightened or the sanctions against Russia should be removed entirely. When it comes to the issue of Georgia joining in on the sanctions against Russia, the public is supportive of joining in sanctions, with 2/3 of the public saying that Georgia should either join in all established sanctions or some of the established sanctions. In this regard, 39% think that the government should join in all established sanctions, and 27% report that they should join in some of the sanctions. Only 19%, or roughly 1 in 5 Georgians, think that Georgia should not participate in any of the sanctions, and a further 14% were uncertain on this question. A key issue that has emerged since the start of the war in Ukraine was Georgia's, as well as Ukraine and Moldova's, Euro-Atlantic integration. In this regard, the survey asked respondents whether or not they supported Georgia's membership in the European Union, as well as NATO. In this regard, the public is still overwhelmingly supportive of the country's Euro-Atlantic future. We see that compared to previous waves of data, we see basically no shift in opinion on this issue. And indeed, the large majority of the public supports joining the European Union as well as NATO. Aside from this, the public is overwhelmingly against joining the Eurasian Customs Union, which is led by the Russian Federation. Since the start of the war, both Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova have all applied for candidate status for membership in the European Union. In this regard, the survey asked whether or not people supported this stance. And what we see is that 2/3 of the public fully support Ukraine, 61% support Georgia in making this decision. The remaining responses tend to be supportive, with only a few single digits of people saying that they don't support this step which Ukraine and Georgia have taken. A further 12% of people were uncertain on this issue. With regard to the performance of Salome Zurabishvili, Irakli Garibashvili, Georgia's parliament, and the Georgian media in relation to the war, what we see is that the public is very positive about both the Georgian media and Salome Zurabishvili's performance. However, they're quite relatively negative about Irakli Garibashvili's performance as well as Georgia's parliament. In this regard, we see that about 2/3 of the public support and say that Salome Zurabishvili has performed positively or very positively in relation to the war. By comparison, Irakli Garibashvili received 41% of people saying the same thing, and a greater share of people saying that his performance was negative or very negative. Georgian parliament's performance is viewed as even more negative. The survey also asked about which party people support. As on most surveys in Georgia, Georgian Dream got about 20% of the data, or 20% support from the public, and large shares of the public refused to answer the question, as well as said they don't know which party is closest to them, or said that no party at all is closest to them. This data was recoded and broken down into 4 groups: supporters of Georgian Dream, supporters of opposition parties, people who don't know which party they support, and people who refuse to answer the question. When it comes to looking at the performance assessment in relation to the war of Salome Zurabishvili, as well as Irakli Garibashvili, we see a few distinctive patterns. First, in Georgian Dream, people are strongly supportive of both Salome Zurabishvili and Irakli Garibashvili's performance. Second, when it comes to opposition parties, people who support no party or don't know which party they support, and those who refuse to answer the question, we see that they're quite positive about Salome Zurabishvili's performance. By contrast, they're relatively negative about Irakli Garibashvili's performance. This brings us to our conclusions and a brief summary of the findings of this study. Overall, we see that the vast majority of Georgians blame Vladimir Putin or Russia for the war. The public wants the government of Georgia to increase its level of support to Ukraine, and they're willing to support almost any step that the government of Georgia could take to support Ukraine. In this regard, we see no change in the Georgian public's commitment to a Euro-Atlantic future for the country. The Georgian public is also broadly supportive of Salome Zurabishvili's performance in relation to the war, and the public is significantly less approving of Irakli Garibashvili's performance in relation to the war. So thank you for watching this video. Slava Ukraine, and have a lovely day.